We followed the Indian through a dismal and ordinary passage, poorly lit and even worse furnished, until he reached a door on the right and swung it open. A bright yellow light poured out, revealing a small man at the center of the illumination. He had an unusually high head, surrounded by a bristle of red hair along the fringe, and a bald, gleaming scalp that protruded like a mountain peak among fir trees. He wrung his hands together as he stood, his features constantly twitching between smiles and scowls, never settling into stillness. Nature had endowed him with a drooping lip and a conspicuous line of yellow, uneven teeth, which he attempted to hide by frequently brushing his hand over the lower part of his face. Despite his prominent baldness, he conveyed an impression of youth, having just turned 30. In a thin, high voice, he repeatedly addressed Miss Morstan as his servant, and then acknowledged the gentlemen present, inviting them to step into his modest sanctum. He described it as a small place furnished to his liking, an oasis of art amidst the desolation of South London. The interior of the room astonished us. In that shabby house, it appeared as out of place as a brilliant diamond set in brass. Rich, glossy curtains and tapestries adorned the walls, pulled back here and there to reveal beautifully framed paintings and oriental vases. The carpet was amber and black, so soft and thick that one's foot sank into it as if into a bed of moss. 2 large tiger skins draped across the carpet added to the sense of Eastern luxury, along with a massive hookah resting on a mat in the corner. A lamp shaped like a silver dove hung from nearly invisible golden wire in the room's center, filling the air with a delicate, aromatic scent as it burned. The little man identified himself as Mr. Thaddeus Sholto, still twitching and smiling. He recognized Miss Morstan and introduced the gentleman present. He expressed excitement upon discovering that a doctor was among them, inquiring if Dr. Watson had his stethoscope, and if he might examine him, as he had serious doubts about his mitral valve. He felt confident about the aortic valve, but valued the doctor's opinion on the mitral. Dr. Watson listened to his heart, as requested, but found nothing wrong, though he noted the man was trembling with fear. He reported that everything seemed normal, and reassured him that he had no reason for concern. Mr. Sholto, with an airy tone, explained his anxiety to Miss Morstan, revealing that he was a great sufferer and had long harbored suspicions about that valve. He also mentioned that had Miss Morstan's father not put a strain on his heart, he might still be alive. Dr. Watson felt a surge of anger at the man's callous reference to such a sensitive topic. Miss Morstan, sitting down, turned pale, and admitted that she had known in her heart that her father was dead. Mr. Sholto offered to provide every piece of information he could, emphasizing his intention to do justice, despite what his brother Bartholomew might say. He expressed pleasure at having their friends present, not just as escorts but as witnesses to what he was about to reveal. He insisted on keeping the matter private, stating that nothing would irritate Brother Bartholomew more than any publicity. He settled onto a low settee and blinked at them with his weak, watery blue eyes. Holmes assured him that whatever he chose to share would remain confidential, and Dr. Watson nodded in agreement. Mr. Sholto expressed his satisfaction with their assurance and offered Miss Morstan a glass of Chianti or Tokay, mentioning that he kept no other wines. When she declined, he hoped they would not mind the smoke from his hookah, which he found calming. He lit the bowl, and the smoke bubbled cheerfully through the rose-water, as they all sat in a semicircle, with their heads leaned forward and chins resting on their hands, while he puffed nervously in the center. When he first decided to communicate with them, he had considered giving his address, but worried they might ignore his request and bring uninvited guests. Thus, he arranged for his man Williams to meet them first, trusting in his discretion. He excused these precautions by noting that he preferred a refined atmosphere and had a natural aversion to roughness, claiming that he was a patron of the arts. He pointed out the genuine Corot landscape, expressed doubt about a Salvator Rosa, and confidently affirmed the authenticity of a Bouguereau, sharing his preference for the modern French school. Miss Morstan interrupted to remind him that she was there at his request to learn something he wished to share. She noted that it was late and preferred to keep the meeting brief. Mr. Sholto replied that, at the very least, it would take some time since they would need to go to Norwood to see Brother Bartholomew. He indicated that they would all confront Brother Bartholomew together, who was quite angry with him for the path he had chosen. He recounted having a heated argument with him the previous night, suggesting that his temper was formidable. I suggested that if they were to go to Norwood, it might be wise to start immediately. Mr. Sholto laughed heartily, his ears turning red, and explained that a sudden arrival would not be prudent. He needed to prepare them by clarifying their relationships and the story he would share, admitting that there were parts of it he did not fully understand. He began by mentioning that his father was Major John Sholto, formerly of the Indian Army, who retired 11 years prior to live at Pondicherry Lodge in Upper Norwood. Having prospered in India, he returned with a considerable fortune, valuable curiosities, and a staff of native servants, allowing him to live luxuriously. Thaddeus and his twin brother Bartholomew were their parents' only children. He vividly recalled the sensations surrounding Captain Morstan's disappearance, having read the details in the papers, and discussed them openly with their father, who had been a friend of Captain Morstan. They had speculated about the circumstances, never suspecting that their father held the entire secret regarding Arthur Morstan's fate. However, they were aware of a looming mystery and danger surrounding their father, who was extremely fearful of venturing out alone. He employed 2 prize fighters as porters at Pondicherry Lodge, one of whom, Williams, had driven them that night. Their father had never disclosed the nature of his fears, but had a peculiar aversion to men with wooden legs. On one occasion, he even fired his revolver at a wooden-legged man who turned out to be a harmless tradesman seeking orders, resulting in a significant hush-money payment. Thaddeus and Bartholomew initially dismissed this as a mere quirk of their father's, but events later led them to reconsider. In early 1882, their father received a letter from India that profoundly shocked him, causing him to nearly faint at the breakfast table. From that moment, he began to deteriorate rapidly. Although the contents of the letter remained a mystery, it was short and scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. He had suffered from an enlarged spleen for years, but worsened significantly afterward. By late April, they were informed that he was beyond hope and wished to make a final communication. When they entered their father's room, he was propped up with pillows and breathing heavily. He urged them to lock the door and come to either side of the bed. Grasping their hands, he made a remarkable statement, his voice trembling with emotion and pain. Thaddeus attempted to recall his father's words precisely. He began by expressing that one thing weighed heavily on his mind at that critical moment. He lamented his treatment of Captain Morstan's orphan, confessing that his greed had unjustly withheld from her the treasure that should have been partially hers. Yet he had made no use of it himself, admitting that his avarice had blinded him. He pointed out a chaplet of pearls beside the quinine bottle, revealing that he had intended to send it to her, but could not bear to part with it. He instructed his sons to ensure she received a fair share of the Agra treasure, but to send her nothing until after his passing. He mentioned that men had recovered from work. He continued, revealing that Captain Morstan had suffered from a weak heart, a secret he had kept from everyone except Thaddeus. Through a series of remarkable events in India, they had come into possession of a substantial treasure, which he brought to England. On the night of Morstan's arrival, he came directly to claim his share, having walked from the station and being admitted by their trusted servant, Lal Chowdar, who was now deceased. A disagreement arose over how to divide the treasure, leading to a heated argument. In a fit of anger, Morstan pressed his hand to his side, turned pale, and collapsed, striking his head against the corner of the treasure chest. Thaddeus found him lifeless when he leaned over. Distraught and unsure of what to do, Thaddeus initially thought to call for help, but realized he might be accused of murder due to the circumstances surrounding Morstan's death. The timing of the argument and the injury would be incriminating. Furthermore, an official inquiry would inevitably reveal details about the treasure that he wanted to keep secret. Morstan had claimed that no one knew of his whereabouts. As he pondered, he noticed his servant, Lal Chowdar, enter the room, locking the door behind him. Lal Chowdar reassured him not to fear, suggesting they hide Morstan's body, ensuring no one would be the wiser. Thaddeus insisted he hadn't killed him, but Lal Chowdar smiled knowingly, claiming he had heard the argument and the blow. He offered to help conceal the body, which Thaddeus found persuasive. If his own servant doubted his innocence, how could he expect a jury to believe him? So they disposed of the body that night, and soon after, the London papers reported the mysterious disappearance of Captain Morstan. Thaddeus argued that he could hardly be blamed for the concealment of both the body and the treasure, as he wished to make restitution. He leaned in closer, urging them to listen carefully, as the treasure was hidden in a specific location. Suddenly, a horrifying change swept over his expression. His eyes widened, his jaw slackened, and he shouted in a voice he could never forget, pleading for them to keep someone out. Both men turned to the window at which he was staring and glimpsed a face peering in from the darkness. They could see the outline of a nose pressed against the glass, a bearded, hairy visage with wild, cruel eyes, and a malicious expression. When they rushed to the window, the figure had vanished. Upon returning to their father, they found he had slumped over, and his pulse had ceased. They searched the garden that night, but found no trace of the intruder except for a single footprint in the flower bed beneath the window. Without that evidence, they might have believed the terrifying face was a figment of their imagination. However, the next morning brought more disturbing signs. Their father's room had been left open, his belongings rifled through, and a torn piece of paper with the words "The Sign of the Four" scrawled on it lay on his chest. They never discovered the meaning of the phrase or the identity of their secret visitor. While it appeared that nothing had been stolen, their belongings had been completely ransacked. Thaddeus and Bartholomew associated the bizarre incident with their father's lifelong fears, but it remained a complete mystery. Taking a moment to relight his hookah, Mr. Sholto puffed thoughtfully as he absorbed their attention with his astonishing tale. Miss Morstan turned pale upon hearing the brief account of her father's death, and for a moment I feared she would faint. She regained her composure after drinking a glass of water that I quietly poured for her from a Venetian carafe on the side table. Sherlock Holmes leaned back in his chair, his expression abstracted, his eyes half closed. I reflected on how he had lamented the dullness of life earlier that day. Here, at least, was a problem that would challenge his intellect to its limits. Mr. Thaddeus Sholto looked from one of us to the other with evident pride at the impact his story had made, and continued between puffs of his oversized pipe. Thaddeus shared that he and his brother had been incredibly excited about the treasure their father had mentioned. For weeks and months they searched every corner of the garden without success. It drove them mad to think that the hiding place was on their father's lips at the moment of his death. They could gauge the treasure's magnificence by the chaplet he had taken out. A discussion arose about the chaplet. Its pearls were clearly valuable, and Bartholomew was reluctant to part with them. He shared his brother's inclination toward their father's avarice, and expressed concern that selling the chaplet might lead to gossip and trouble. Thaddeus had to convince him to allow him to find Miss Morstan's address, and send her a pearl periodically, so she would never feel destitute. Miss Morstan remarked that it was a kind gesture, expressing gratitude for the thoughtfulness. Thaddeus waved his hand dismissively, asserting that they were her trustees, though Bartholomew did not entirely agree. They had sufficient funds of their own, and he desired no more, believing it would be in poor taste to treat a young lady poorly. He quoted the French saying that bad taste leads to crime. Their disagreement on the matter led him to rent rooms for himself, leaving Pondicherry Lodge with their old Kit Mutgar and Williams. However, he had learned of an important development. The treasure had been discovered. He immediately contacted Miss Morstan, and they needed to go to Norwood to claim their share. He had explained his intentions to Bartholomew the night before, meaning they would be expected, though not necessarily welcome. Mr Thaddeus Sholto concluded and sat twitching on his lavish settee. We remained silent, contemplating the new developments in this mysterious affair. Holmes was the first to rise. He commended Mr Sholto for his thoroughness and suggested they might shed light on the lingering darkness surrounding the situation. However, as Miss Morstan had noted, it was late, and they should address the matter without delay. Mr Sholto carefully coiled the tube of his hookah and retrieved a long befrogged topcoat with an astrakhan collar and cuffs from behind a curtain. Despite the warm night, he buttoned it tightly and completed his outfit with a rabbit-skin cap that covered his ears, leaving only his expressive face visible. He explained that his health was fragile and that he had had to maintain a delicate constitution. Their cab awaited them outside, evidently part of a prearranged plan, as the driver set off at once at a swift pace. Thaddeus Sholto talked incessantly, his voice rising above the clatter of the wheels. He described his brother Bartholomew as clever, inquiring how they thought he had discovered the treasure's location. Bartholomew had concluded it was hidden indoors, meticulously measuring the cubic space of the house to ensure that no inch went unaccounted for. Among other findings, he noted that the height of the building was 74 feet, but after calculating the heights of all the rooms and accounting for the space between them, he could only account for 70 feet. The missing 4 feet could only be in the attic. He knocked a hole in the lath and plaster ceiling of the highest room and discovered a sealed-off garret above, where the treasure chest sat atop 2 rafters. He lowered it through the hole, estimating its value at no less than £500,000 sterling. At the mention of such an enormous sum, we exchanged astonished glances. Miss Morstan, if she secured her rightful claim, would transform from a struggling governess to the wealthiest heiress in England. It should have been a moment for a loyal friend to celebrate, yet I felt a wave of selfishness wash over me, and my heart became heavy with dread. I managed to mumble a few halting words of congratulations, but quickly fell silent, my head bowed, oblivious to the chatter of our new acquaintance. It was clear that he was a chronic hypochondriac, and I was vaguely aware that he was recounting endless symptoms and seeking advice on various quack remedies, some of which he carried in a leather case in his pocket. I hoped he would not remember any of my responses that night. Holmes later claimed he overheard me cautioning him against taking more than 2 drops of castor oil, while I mistakenly recommended large doses of strychnine as a sedative. Regardless, I felt relieved when our cab came to a sudden stop, and the coachman jumped down to open the door.